The fever broke somewhere around 4 a.m., and by the time the sun came up I could finally stand without the room tilting sideways. That should have been the good part of the day. Instead, I came downstairs to find 2 suitcases sitting by the front door, and they weren't mine, except they were, because I recognized my own gray hard-shell luggage sitting there packed with my own clothes, folded by someone who clearly hadn't cared how it looked. Natalie was standing in the kitchen with a cup of coffee like it was any other Tuesday. "You need to go stay somewhere else for a while," she said. "Not we need to talk. Not how are you feeling. Just a logistics update, delivered the way you'd tell a contractor the delivery window had changed." I was still in the sweatpants I'd been wearing for 6 days straight, still 10 pounds lighter than I'd been the week before, still weak enough that gripping the stair railing took actual thought. I'd spent the better part of a week with a fever that peaked at 103.6, lungs that sounded like a plastic bag crackling every time I inhaled, and a wife who'd brought me soup exactly twice. "Go where, Nat?" I asked. "I don't know. Your brother's. A hotel. I just need space." She didn't look up from her coffee. "I'm still sick." "You're better than you were," she said, which was true and also completely beside the point. "I can't keep doing this, Ethan. I can't keep pretending everything's fine in this house." I stood there in my own kitchen, in the house we bought together on Everett Street 6 years earlier, looking at 2 suitcases packed by a woman who wanted me gone before I'd even finished being sick, and I felt something that wasn't quite anger and wasn't quite grief. It was closer to clarity. Because there was one thing standing in that kitchen that Natalie didn't know. 3 days before she packed those bags, I had already filed for divorce. My name is Ethan Cole. I'm 42 years old. I run a private lending and investment firm out of Seattle called Cole Bridge Capital, and for 11 years I built a life with a woman I believed loved me the way I loved her. I want to tell you what happened in the 6 weeks before that morning in the kitchen, because the suitcases weren't the beginning of the story. They were the end of one I'd already quietly decided to close. Part 1, How We Got Here. I met Natalie Hargrove 9 years ago at a charity gala for a children's hospital in Bellevue. She was 27, working as an event coordinator for a boutique planning company, the kind of job where you spend 18-hour days making sure other people's celebrations go perfectly and nobody remembers your name at the end of the night. I was 33, 3 years into running my own firm after leaving a private equity shop where I'd spent my 20s learning how capital actually moves in the world. She had this way of managing a room. I watched her for 20 minutes before I ever said a word to her, watching her calm down an overwrought caterer, redirect a wandering photographer, and somehow make the hospital's development director feel like the most important person in the building, all without ever raising her voice or looking rattled. I've built a career on reading people in high-pressure rooms, and I recognized competence when I saw it. We talked for an hour that night, mostly about nothing. She asked good questions. She listened like she meant it. I called her 3 days later and asked her to dinner, and she said yes before I'd even finished the sentence. We dated for 2 years before I proposed. I want to be honest about what those years looked like, because it matters for what comes later. Natalie was sharp and funny and endlessly capable, but she'd grown up in a family where money was tight and appearances mattered more than they should have. Her father, Gerald Hargrove, ran a small chain of boutique inns along the Washington coast, 3 properties that had been in various states of financial trouble for most of her childhood. Her mother had left when Natalie was 12, and Gerald had raised her and her younger brother, Marcus, largely on charm and borrowed money. I understood that background because it explained things about her. It explained why she cared so much about how things looked, why a scuffed pair of shoes could ruin her whole morning, why she flinched slightly whenever a credit card got declined at a restaurant, even once we were well past the point where that would ever happen to us. I didn't see any of that as a flaw. I saw it as a wound, and I thought love meant helping someone heal a wound like that, not by talking about it, but by making sure she never had to feel that kind of instability again. We got married in a vineyard outside Woodinville. 140 guests. Her father gave a toast that ran 12 minutes too long and somehow still made half the room cry. My father, Walter, a retired firefighter who'd spent 30 years pulling people out of buildings, gave a much shorter one, and the only line I remember from it was, "Ethan doesn't say much about what he's building until it's already built." Natalie, you're about to find out what that means. He wasn't wrong. I should say something here about what the first 2 years of the marriage actually looked like, because I think it matters for understanding how slowly the rest of it unraveled. We were, by almost any measure, good together in the beginning. Natalie had a gift for making ordinary evenings feel like something worth remembering. She'd turn a Tuesday night dinner into an event just by lighting candles and putting on the right record, not because she was performing for anyone, but because she genuinely believed a life was made up of small, well-tended moments rather than big occasional ones. I used to tell people that marrying an event planner meant every day of my life had slightly better production value than it deserved, and I meant it as the highest compliment I knew how to give. She came to my office once, early on, unannounced, just to see where I spent my days. I remember watching her walk through the coal bridge floor, past the small conference room where I closed most of my early deals, and stop in front of a framed photo on my desk of my father in his fire department uniform, taken the year before he retired. "He looks like you," she said. "Same eyes. Same way of standing, like he's already solved the problem before anyone's finished explaining it. He taught me most of what I know about staying calm when something's on fire," I told her. "Literally, in his case. And in yours?" "In mine it's usually just money," I said. "Slower fire. Same principle." She laughed at that, a real laugh, the kind that made 2 of my junior analysts look up from their desks. I think about that moment a lot now, because it's one of the clearest memories I have of a version of Natalie who seemed genuinely curious about the parts of my life that didn't involve her directly. Not managing them, not performing interest in them for the sake of the relationship, just actually wanting to understand how I thought. I don't know exactly when that curiosity started to fade. I only know that by the time I noticed it was gone, it had already been gone for a while. 2 years into the marriage, Gerald's ins hit a wall. A refinancing balloon payment came due on the flagship property in Port Townsend, and the bank wasn't interested in extending terms. Natalie came to me one night, not asking directly, just talking around it the way people do when they want something they're afraid to name. I didn't make her ask. I structured a private loan through Coal Bridge, secured against the property, at terms that were generous but not charitable, because I've never believed that doing right by family means doing it stupidly. $410,000. I also took a 15% equity stake in Hargrove Hospitality Group as part of the deal, mostly as a formality, mostly because Diane, my attorney, insisted that any loan of that size needed real collateral behind it, not just goodwill. Gerald called me his son from that point forward, which should have been touching and mostly was. Over the next several years, I stayed quiet about the business, the way I'd stayed quiet during our courtship, letting Natalie run point on family matters, letting Gerald believe the loan was mostly a gesture between family rather than the fully collateralized instrument it actually was. I went to every holiday. I fixed the flagship property's HVAC financing when it needed refinancing again. I never once brought it up at dinner unless someone else did first. We didn't have kids, which was a decision we made together early and never really revisited, and looking back now I think that absence made it easier for both of us to build separate lives inside the same house without either of us fully noticing it happening. Part 2, The First Crack. I want to tell you about the renovation, because that's where this actually starts. About 14 months ago, Natalie decided the house on Everett Street needed a full kitchen and primary bathroom remodel. She'd been talking about it for years, and with the business finally stable, we agreed to do it properly. She hired a contractor named Trent Ashford, referred by a friend from her old planning circles, a guy in his late 30s who ran a design-build firm out of Fremont with a decent enough reputation and, from the 2 times I met him, an easy charm that seemed to work particularly well on people who wanted to be flattered. I didn't think much of him at first. I shook his hand at the initial walkthrough, told him what I cared about: timeline, budget discipline, no change orders without a real conversation first, and then I got out of the way, because that's how I run every project in my life. I hire the right person and I let them work. The renovation took 5 months instead of the projected 3. I noticed the delays but didn't think much of them. Construction always runs long. What I noticed more, in hindsight, was how much time Natalie started spending checking in on the project. Site visits that ran 2 hours longer than any decision could possibly require. Text threads with Trent that she'd close out of when I walked by, not dramatically, just a quick, practiced flip of the phone facedown that I filed away without fully registering it at the time. About 6 months ago, the renovation finished. Trent's involvement in our lives should have ended there. It didn't. Natalie started mentioning him in ways that felt, retroactively, like she was testing how much room she had. Trent said the tile guy in Ballard is better than the one we used. Trent's doing a project near the lake, we should see it when it's done. Small threads, dropped casually, the kind of thing you'd never notice unless you were the kind of person who spent 20 years learning to notice small threads for a living. I am that kind of person. It's the only reason Cole Bridge exists at all. €, the ability to see the load-bearing detail in a deal that everyone else is skipping past. So I started paying attention, quietly, the way I'd pay attention to a portfolio company whose numbers had started drifting in a direction nobody wanted to explain. There's one conversation from that period I keep coming back to, because at the time I brushed it off, and in hindsight it was the clearest warning I got from anyone. My business partner's wife, a woman named Delphine who'd known Natalie socially for years through the same charity circuit where we'd originally met, pulled me aside at a fundraising dinner about 2 months before I found anything concrete. "Is everything okay with you and Nat?" she asked, in the careful tone people use when they already suspect the answer isn't simple. "As far as I know," I said. "Why?" She hesitated, swirling the wine in her glass, clearly deciding how much to say. "She just seems different lately. Lighter, almost. I saw her at the Fremont Sunday Market a few weeks back, laughing with some guy, really laughing, the kind of laughing you don't usually see people do over groceries. I didn't think anything of it until I saw how she looked at him when he walked away. Could have been a friend," I said, and I remember saying it lightly, the way you dismiss something you're not ready to actually consider. "Could have been," Delphine agreed, in a tone that made clear she didn't believe that any more than I secretly did. "I just wanted you to hear it from me instead of wondering later why nobody said anything." I thanked her and let it go, mostly because I didn't yet have anything to attach the comment to, and partly, if I'm honest, because some part of me wasn't ready to go looking for confirmation of something I already had a bad feeling about. It took another 2 months and a misdialed voicemail before I stopped being able to look away from it. Part 3, What I Found. I'm not going to walk you through every detail of how I confirmed it, because most of it is unremarkable. €, a credit card statement with a hotel charge in Kirkland on a Tuesday afternoon when Natalie had told me she was at a client lunch, a location tag on a photo she'd forgotten to strip, a voicemail from Trent that came through on our home landline, a number I didn't even know we still had connected, meant for her cell and misdialed by 1 digit. Small mistakes. People having affairs are rarely as careful as they think they are, because the entire structure of an affair depends on you believing the person you're deceiving isn't paying attention. I was paying attention. By the time I had what I needed, I understood the shape of it. It had been going on for approximately 5 months, starting shortly after the renovation wrapped, not during it, which I noted only because it told me something about Natalie. €, she hadn't crossed the line while he was still technically working for us. She'd waited until the professional relationship ended and then let the personal one begin, which felt, in its own strange way, like the last piece of discipline she had left. I want to walk through exactly how the pieces came together, because I think the specifics matter more than the general shape of it. The hotel charge was the first real thread. €, a $240 charge from a Kirkland hotel on a Tuesday afternoon, showing up on the joint card we used for household expenses, on a day Natalie had told me at breakfast she'd be at a client lunch in Bellevue for most of the afternoon. Kirkland and Bellevue aren't far apart, but they're not the same place either, and a $240 charge doesn't match any lunch I've ever heard of. I didn't say anything that night. I opened the hotel's website instead, looked at their room rates, and confirmed that $240 matched almost exactly one night in their standard king room, plus tax, booked same day. I sat with that information for 11 days before anything else surfaced, turning it over the way I'd turn over an anomaly in a set of financials, looking for an innocent explanation before assuming the worst one. The photo came next €1, a picture Natalie posted to a private Instagram story, meant only for close friends, that I still had access to because neither of us had ever bothered to update our follower lists after the wedding. It was an otherwise unremarkable shot of a coffee cup on a marble countertop, the kind of image people post without thinking, and she'd forgotten to strip the location tag before uploading it. The tag placed it at a rooftop apartment building in South Lake Union, a building I happened to recognize because Cole Bridge had underwritten a bridge loan on a unit there 2 years earlier. I looked up the building's ownership records that same night. One of the units belonged to a development LLC controlled, according to state business filings, by a man named Trent Ashford. The voicemail was the last piece, and it was almost comically small, €1, a misdialed call that landed on our home landline instead of Natalie's cell, one digit off, the kind of mistake anyone could make. Trent's voice, warm and easy, saying, "Hey, it's me, just checking if we're still on for Thursday, same place as last time," before he realized, mid-message, that he'd reached the wrong number and hung up without finishing the thought. Individually, none of those three things would have held up to real scrutiny. Together, they built a picture I could no longer talk myself out of. I didn't confront her. I want to explain why, because I think most people would have. Confrontation feels like the honest move, the emotionally direct move, the thing you're supposed to do when you find out someone you love has betrayed you. But I've spent 2 decades in rooms where the person who reacts first is almost always the person who loses the most. Confrontation without a plan is just an announcement that you know, and an announcement gives the other side time to get their story straight, hide what needs hiding, and prepare their defense. I didn't want a defense. I wanted the truth to exist in a form nobody could talk their way out of. So I called Priya. Part 4, The 3 Days. Priya Anand has been my attorney for 9 years. She handled the initial loan documents for Gerald's business, she's handled every material contract Cole Bridge has signed since 2019, and she is, without exception, the calmest person I have ever watched receive bad news. I called her on a Sunday evening, which she later told me she remembered specifically because I have never once called her on a weekend in 9 years of working together. "I need to file for divorce," I told her. Quietly. "And I need you to tell me what to do with the Hargrove equity stake before I do anything else." She didn't ask me why. She asked me what I had. I told her everything, €1, the hotel charge, the photo, the voicemail, 5 months of a pattern I could now see clearly once I knew where to look. She was quiet for a moment, and then she said the thing I needed to hear from someone whose entire job was staying rational when I couldn't fully trust my own read on the situation anymore. "Washington's a no-fault state, so none of this changes whether you get divorced. But it changes everything about timing and leverage. Do you want this to be slow or fast? Fast. And clean. I don't want a single thing left exposed that she or her family can use against me later. Then here's what we do." Over the next 3 days, Priya and I built the entire architecture of what would become the end of my marriage, and we did it without Natalie having any idea it was happening. Day 1, Priya drew up the divorce petition. Washington doesn't require you to serve immediately after filing, and she advised holding the actual filing until we'd secured the more complicated piece first, €1, the Hargrove equity. I agreed. We didn't file that day. We prepared to. Day 1, later that evening, I moved my personal files and the physical assets that mattered to me, €1, my father's old service medals, a first edition of a book my grandfather had given me, the hard drive with 11 years of Cole Bridge deal history, €1, into a safe deposit box downtown. Nothing dramatic. Nothing Natalie would notice missing, because none of it lived in visible places in our house to begin with. Day 2, I called Gerald. This was the hardest call, not because I owed him softness, but because I'd spent 9 years building something with that man that had nothing to do with his daughter's choices, and I knew that what I was about to do would end that relationship along with the marriage. I told him I was divorcing Natalie. I didn't tell him why, not yet, because that wasn't information he needed from me in order to understand what came next. I told him that as part of the separation of assets, I'd be selling my 15% stake in Hargrove Hospitality Group, and that I expected the loan terms to remain exactly as documented, in full, on the original schedule, no renegotiation. I remember the sound of the television in the background of that call, some evening news broadcast Gerald must have had on low in his den, and I remember thinking, in the strange fractured way you notice irrelevant details during the most important conversations of your life, that somewhere in that same house Natalie had probably eaten dinner 100 times while I sat 200 miles away in Seattle trusting both of them with a piece of my life I'd never bothered to fully protect. Gerald went quiet for a long moment on the phone. Ethan, that stake €1, if you sell that on the open market, or to a fund, they're not going to be as patient as you've been. They're going to want board influence. They're going to want covenants. I know, I said. That's not something I can solve for you anymore, Gerald. I'm sorry. He asked me, very carefully, whether this had anything to do with Trent Ashford. I told him I'd let him draw his own conclusions. Day 3, Priya filed the divorce petition in King County Superior Court. She also filed, quietly and separately, paperwork initiating the sale of my Hargrove equity stake to a regional hospitality investment group she'd identified through a colleague €1, a group that, unlike me, would absolutely want board seats and operational covenants once they took a position. I wasn't trying to destroy Gerald's business. I want to be clear about that, the same way I imagine most people in my position would want to be clear about it. Hargrove Hospitality was a real business with real value, and I wasn't going to torch it out of spite. But I also wasn't going to remain a silent, generous, endlessly patient investor in a family that had, at minimum, allowed a man to circle my marriage for 5 months without a single person warning me. The petition was filed. The sale process was initiated. Natalie knew none of it. That same night €1, the night of day 3 €1, I started feeling the ache behind my eyes that I now recognize as the first sign of what became 9 days of the worst flu of my adult life, cascading eventually into a walking pneumonia that had me sleeping sitting up because lying flat made my lungs feel like they were filling with water. Part 5, Getting Sick. I want to slow down here, because I think this is the part of the story people relate to the most, even if they've never lived through the specific betrayal €1. Everyone knows what it feels like to be genuinely, helplessly sick, dependent on someone else for basic things, and to realize in that state exactly how much or how little that person actually cares. I've never been someone who gets sick often. I can count on one hand the number of times in the last decade I've missed a full week of work for illness, which is part of why what happened over those 9 days felt so disorienting €1, not just the physical experience of it, but the strange psychological experience of being forced, for the first time in years, into total dependence on someone else at the exact moment I discovered I couldn't actually depend on her at all. The first symptom was a tightness behind my sternum that I initially chalked up to stress, which wasn't an unreasonable guess given that I'd filed for divorce 2 days earlier and initiated the sale of a $2 million equity position the day after that. By that Thursday night, the tightness had become a genuine ache, radiating up into my throat, and I remember lying in bed next to Natalie, both of us facing away from each other, and thinking that the distance between us in that bed had become a physical fact of the marriage long before either of us had said a word about it out loud. The fever hit hard on a Thursday night, for days after I'd filed the petition, 1 day after Priya had confirmed the hospitality group's initial term sheet for the Hargrove stake. I chalked it up to exhaustion at first €1. I'd been running on almost no sleep for the better part of 2 weeks, holding together a business, a legal filing, and a marriage that I now understood to be a performance I was the only one still bothering to give. By Saturday, I had a fever of 102 and a cough that had moved from my throat into my chest. Natalie brought me a bowl of soup on Saturday night, sat on the edge of the bed for maybe 4 minutes while I ate it, told me to feel better, and went back downstairs to take a phone call. I remember watching her leave the room and thinking, with the strange flat clarity that comes with a high fever, that I already knew who was on the other end of that call, and that some small, stubborn part of me had been hoping I was wrong about all of it right up until that exact moment. By Monday, my fever spiked to 103.6. I called my doctor's office and got a virtual visit that afternoon. They told me to monitor for shortness of breath and go to urgent care if it got worse, gave me a course of antibiotics as a precaution against secondary infection, and told me to rest. Natalie was in the house that day. She worked from the guest room, told me she didn't want to catch what I had, and came upstairs twice a euro, once to bring water, once to ask, with what I can only describe as clinical detachment, whether I needed her to refill my prescription. I didn't ask her to sit with me. I didn't ask her for anything, actually, past that point, because some instinct in me, even fevered and half out of my mind, understood that asking and being refused would hurt worse than simply not asking at all. By Wednesday euro, 6 days into being sick, 1 day before she packed the suitcases euro, my fever finally started to break. I could hold down food again. I could climb the stairs without my heart pounding out of rhythm. And that was the day Natalie came into the bedroom, sat down not on the edge of the bed but in the armchair across the room, a distance I noticed even through the fog of recovery, and said the words that told me, more clearly than any hotel receipt ever could, exactly where things stood. I think I need some space, Ethan. I think I've needed it for a while. I asked her what that meant. I don't know yet. I just know I can't keep doing this euro, this house, this routine, this version of us. I need room to think. I told her I understood, which was true in a way she didn't understand, because I'd been giving her exactly that kind of room, legally and financially, for 6 days already. I want to note something about that conversation that I didn't fully process until much later. She never once asked how I was feeling, physically, during that entire exchange. Not are you well enough to talk about this, not should we wait until you're stronger. She'd clearly been building up to that conversation for days, rehearsing it the way people rehearse things they've already decided to say regardless of timing, and my health simply wasn't a variable in her planning. I remember noting that at the time, filing it away the same clinical way I'd filed away the hotel charge and the location tag in the voicemail, one more data point confirming a conclusion I'd already reached. That night, lying awake with my fever finally starting to break, I thought about something Priya had said to me on our very first call, almost as an aside. The people who wait to leave until the other person is at their weakest, she'd said, aren't doing it because they're cruel, usually. They're doing it because weakness is the only moment where they don't have to justify the timing to themselves. It's easier to leave a man who's sick and can't fight back than a man who's healthy and might ask hard questions. I didn't fully understand what she meant until Tuesday morning, watching Natalie hand me a suitcase she'd packed while I was too fevered most of that week to notice her going through my closet. Part 6, The Suitcases. That brings us back to Tuesday morning, the kitchen, the coffee, the 2 suitcases packed with my own clothes. Go where, Nat? I'd asked her. I don't know. Your brother's. A hotel. I just need space. I looked at those suitcases for a long moment, and I thought about my father, the way he used to talk about fires euro, not the dramatic ones, the ones that made the news, but the slow ones, the electrical fires that smolder behind a wall for hours before anyone smells smoke. By the time you see flame, he used to say, the real damage already happened somewhere you couldn't see it. Okay, I said. That single word did something to her expression I wasn't expecting. She'd clearly braced for an argument, for pleading, for the version of this conversation where I begged to stay in my own house while sick, and instead she got a flat, calm agreement, and I watched her recalibrate in real time, the way people do when the reaction they prepared for doesn't arrive. Okay. She repeated. That's it. You want space. I'll give you space. I picked up one of the suitcases. It was heavier than it should have been. She'd packed things I didn't even wear anymore, like she'd been going through my closet methodically, deciding what parts of me she was ready to remove from the house. I'll stay at my brother's for a few days. You're being very calm about this, she said, and there was something almost accusatory in it, like my composure was itself an offense. I'm sick, Natalie. I don't have the energy to be anything else right now. That part, at least, was completely true. I called Caleb from the car, still parked in our driveway, my hands not quite steady from 6 days of illness and the particular kind of adrenaline that comes from watching a plan you built alone finally start to move on its own. My brother runs a construction supply company out of Tacoma, the kind of business where he's up at 5 and elbow deep in inventory problems by 6, and he picked up on the second ring. "She kicked you out," he said, once I'd explained, and I could hear the controlled anger in his voice, the kind our father raised us both to keep controlled rather than express. "While you're still sick?" "She doesn't know I already filed," I said. There was a pause on his end, the kind of pause that meant he was recalculating everything he thought this conversation was going to be. "Filed what?" "For divorce. 3 days ago." Caleb didn't say anything for a moment, and then he laughed not a happy laugh, but the kind of laugh that comes out when something makes a terrible, perfect kind of sense all at once. "So she's out here kicking her sick husband out of the house he pays for, thinking she's the one taking control of the situation. That's about the shape of it. Come stay with me. Don't tell her anything else. Let the paperwork do the talking." That was almost exactly what our father would have said, and when I called Walter that night from Caleb's guest room, it was more or less what he did say, once I'd walked him through the whole thing: the affair, the loan, the equity sale, the filing, the fever, the suitcases. "You didn't yell at her," he said. "It wasn't a question." "No." "Good. You never win anything by yelling at a fire. You put it out or you let it burn itself out, and either way, yelling doesn't change how fast that happens." He was quiet for a second. "How do you feel?" Nobody had asked me that in 9 days. Not Natalie, not the doctor passed the clinical checklist, not even Priya, whose job wasn't to ask that question. I sat there in my brother's guest room, still weak, still recovering, and I told my father the truest thing I could find. "Tired," I said. "Tired in a way that isn't just about being sick." "That'll pass," he said. "The tired that comes from finally seeing something clearly, that kind always passes faster than the tired that comes from not knowing. You know now. That's the hard part. Everything after this is just logistics." He wasn't wrong about that either. If you've made it this far, I want to ask you to hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below telling me whether you think staying calm in a moment like this is strength or just a different kind of avoidance. I read every comment, and I want to know what you think, because I'm honestly still not entirely sure myself. Part 7, The Process Server. Natalie was served on a Thursday, 4 days after the suitcases, at her office in Bellevue, a detail I only know because she told me about it herself, later, with a rawness in her voice I hadn't heard from her in years. I found out it happened because my phone started ringing that afternoon, over and over, the way a phone rings when someone's trying to reach you before you can prepare an answer. I let the first 4 calls go to voicemail. On the 5th, I picked up. "You filed for divorce," she said, no hello, no preamble. "You filed for divorce before I even asked you to leave." 3 days before, I confirmed. "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because you didn't say anything either, Nat. Not about Trent. Not about 5 months of it. I figured we were both keeping quiet about the important parts of our lives, so I decided to keep quiet about mine too." The silence on the other end of the line lasted long enough that I checked to see if the call had dropped. "How long have you known?" she finally asked. "Long enough. Ethan, she stopped. Started again. "I was going to tell you eventually. I just didn't know how." "You didn't have to tell me anything, Natalie. I found it on my own. The hotel in Kirkland. The voicemail on the landline. The 5 months since the renovation ended. I did the math myself, the same way I do the math on every deal that comes across my desk, and I came to a conclusion, and then I acted on it. That's not a betrayal. That's just how I operate." "You sold the equity stake in my father's company," she said, And now there was real fear underneath the anger, the kind of fear that comes from watching a foundation you didn't know you were standing on start to move. I did. Do you understand what that does to him? To the business he spent his whole life building? I understand exactly what it does, I said. I built the terms of that loan myself. I know precisely what it means for a hospitality fund with real covenants to step into a 15% position that used to be held by someone who never once asked for a board seat in 9 years. I know because I made sure it would mean something. That was the point. This is punishment, she said. You're punishing my whole family because of what I did. No, I said, and I meant this part completely, the same way I'd meant it 3 days earlier when I explained it to Priya. I'm removing myself from a financial relationship that only made sense as long as the personal relationship underneath it was real. It stopped being real 5 months ago, Natalie. I just found out about it a few weeks later than you'd have preferred. Part 8, The Conversation in the Kitchen. She came to Caleb's place 2 days after that call, which surprised me, because I hadn't expected her to show up in person. Caleb let her in and then, with the particular tact he shares with our father, found an excuse to be somewhere else in the house. She looked different than she had in the kitchen the week before. The composure was gone. Her eyes were red in a way that suggested she'd been crying on and off for days rather than in one clean burst, and there was a rawness to her that I recognized, distantly, as something close to the version of her I'd fallen in love with 9 years earlier before the careful management, before the performance, before whatever had slowly replaced the person underneath it. I need you to understand something, she said, sitting down across from me at Caleb's kitchen table. I didn't plan for it to happen with Trent. I know that's what everyone says, but it's true. It started small. He'd ask about my day. He noticed things you'd stopped noticing. Careful, I said, not unkindly. That's the part where you try to make this my fault, and I'd rather you didn't, because I don't think you actually believe that, and I don't think it'll make either of us feel better. She stopped. Nodded slightly, like she recognized the trap she'd been about to walk into even as she was walking into it. I got scared, she said instead. Watching you build all of this the business, the stake in Dad's company, the way you just quietly handle everything without ever needing credit for it I started feeling like I was standing next to something instead of being part of it. And Trent made me feel like the center of something again, even if what I was the center of wasn't real. I hear that, I said. I do. But I want you to hear something too. You didn't have to burn the whole thing down to feel like the center of something. You could have told me you felt invisible. I would have listened. I've spent 11 years listening to you, Natalie, even during the parts of this last decade where you clearly stopped listening back. You never told me you felt anything, she said. You just handle things. You handled my dad's business. You handled the divorce. You handled getting sick without ever once asking me to actually take care of you. How am I supposed to feel like your wife when you don't need me for anything? That landed harder than I expected it to, and I sat with it for a moment before answering, because I wanted to give her a true answer instead of a quick one. I needed you to sit with me for longer than 4 minutes while I had a 103 fever, I said finally. I needed you to ask me how I was doing instead of whether I needed a prescription refilled. I did need things from you, Nat. You just weren't looking for them, because you'd already started looking somewhere else. She didn't have an answer for that, and I didn't need her to have one. Some conversations aren't actually about resolving anything. They're about both people finally saying the true version of events out loud, once, before moving into whatever comes next. She was quiet for a while after that, turning her coffee cup slowly on the kitchen table, and I let the silence sit rather than filling it, the same way I'd let the silence sit in 100 negotiations where saying nothing accomplished more than saying something ever could have. I keep replaying the morning with the suitcases, she finally said. I told myself I was being decisive. Taking control of something instead of just waiting for it to fall apart on its own. But I think what I was actually doing was trying to be the one who left first, so it would feel like my decision instead of a consequence of what I'd already done. That's probably true, I said. For what it's worth, I understand the impulse, even if I don't think it was fair to do it while I was still recovering. I know it wasn't fair, she said. I knew it wasn't fair while I was doing it, honestly. I just didn't know how else to make myself actually go through with it. I think some part of me needed you to be too weak to talk me out of it. That admission sat between us for a long moment, and I found myself, unexpectedly, grateful for it not because it excused anything, but because it was the first completely honest thing she'd said to me since the whole situation started unraveling, and honesty, even this late and this useless, was still worth something. What happens now? She asked. The divorce moves forward. Priya will handle the settlement conversations with your attorney. The house is going to have to be sold or bought out. We'll figure out which makes sense financially. And your father's business will need to find its footing with new investors, which I know is going to be hard, and I'm sorry it's hard, but I'm not sorry I did it. Do you hate me? She asked, very quietly, and it was the first time in the entire conversation she sounded like she actually wanted the answer rather than needing to hear a particular one. No, I said, and it was true. I think you got scared and made a choice you can't take back, the same way I got sick and made a choice I can't take back either. I don't hate you. I just don't trust you anymore, and I don't know how to be married to someone I can't trust. She left not long after that. I watched her walk to her car from Caleb's front window, and I felt the thing I imagine most people feel at the actual end of something long. Not relief exactly, and not grief exactly, but the strange flat quiet that comes after a long negotiation finally closes, whether or not you got everything you wanted out of it. Part 9, The Mediation. Before any of the fallout settled into its final shape, there was a mediation session I need to tell you about, because it's the moment I understood just how completely the balance of the relationship had shifted. Priya had recommended mediation over straight litigation, mostly because Washington courts favor it and mostly because, in her words, you don't need a judge to tell you what's fair, Ethan, you already know what's fair, you just need Natalie's side to agree to it without a 2-year fight. We met in a conference room on the 14th floor of a building downtown, a room with a long glass table and a view of Elliott Bay that felt almost deliberately calming, the kind of room designed to keep two people from raising their voices at each other no matter what was being decided inside it. Natalie's attorney was a younger woman named Corinne Blake, sharp and clearly good at her job, and she opened by asking for the house outright, half of Cole Bridge's valuation as of the marriage date, and ongoing spousal support for 18 months while Natalie, in Corinne's words, re-established her professional footing. Priya didn't flinch. She laid out, calmly and with the same flat precision she brings to every negotiation I've watched her run, the actual structure of our finances. That Cole Bridge had been founded 4 years before the marriage and remained separate property under Washington law regardless of any growth during the marriage, that the down payment on the Everett Street house had come almost entirely from my premarital savings, and that Natalie's own professional trajectory, including 2 promotions at her planning firm during the marriage, undercut any claim that she'd sacrificed her career for the relationship in a way that warranted extended support. We're not trying to be adversarial, Priya said, in the tone she uses when she's about to be exactly that. We're trying to reflect what actually happened financially over the last 9 years, which is that Ethan built almost everything material in this marriage before it began, and continued building it largely on his own initiative throughout, including a $2 million equity sale that Natalie's own family benefited from significantly more than she's currently acknowledging. I watched Natalie during all of this. She sat very still, hands folded on the table, and I could see her doing the math in real time, watching a version of the marriage she'd probably told herself for years. One where she'd contributed as much as I had, where the house and the business and the stability were things we'd built jointly. Collide with the plain documentation Priya was laying out page by page. It wasn't a comfortable thing to watch. I didn't take any pleasure in it, despite what I imagine some people listening to this might assume. I just watched a set of facts finally become undeniable to the one person who'd spent the better part of a year avoiding them. We settled that day, mostly along the lines Priya had proposed. The house would be sold, proceeds split roughly 70-30 in my favor given the premarital down payment, no ongoing spousal support beyond a modest 6-month bridge to account for the immediate disruption, and each of us keeping our own retirement accounts as accrued. Natalie signed without much of a fight, which surprised Corinne more than it surprised me. I think by that point she understood there wasn't a version of this negotiation where the facts bent in her favor, and she'd rather close it cleanly than drag out something that was only going to get more painful to relitigate. On our way out of the building, she caught up to me at the elevator bank, alone, Corinne having stayed behind to finish some paperwork. Corinne caught up with Priya near the elevator too, and the two of them exchanged the kind of brief professional pleasantries that happen after a mediation closes cleanly rather than dragging into litigation, the sort of mutual respect that exists between two people who do the same difficult job well even when they're technically on opposite sides of the table. I heard Corinne say something to Priya about how rare it was to see a case this contentious in its origins settle in a single session, and Priya's response, which I only caught the tail end of, was something like, "It settles fast when one side already knows exactly what they want and the other side is still figuring out what they lost." "You didn't have to be that thorough," Natalie said quietly, once we'd stepped away from both attorneys. "You could have just asked for the split and let it be simpler." "I could have," I agreed. "But I've spent my whole career being thorough, Nat. I wasn't going to stop being who I am just because the deal in front of me happened to be my marriage instead of a portfolio company." She almost smiled at that, a small, tired thing. "That's the most honest thing you've said to me in months." "I've been honest with you the whole time," I said. "I just wasn't loud about it. There's a difference, even if it didn't always feel that way from where you were standing." Part 10, The House. The house on Everett Street sold 4 months after the mediation, to a young couple expecting their first child, the kind of buyers who walked through the kitchen Natalie had renovated and immediately started talking about where they'd put a high chair. I did the final walkthrough alone, the week before closing, because Natalie had already moved her remaining things out and didn't see any reason for both of us to be there for what amounted to a formality. I stood in that kitchen for a long time before I locked up for the last time. 6 years of a life had happened in that room. The morning I found out Coalbridge had closed its first 8-figure deal, standing at that same counter reading the wire confirmation on my phone while Natalie made coffee and asked, half joking, whether this meant we could finally redo the bathroom, the night before our wedding anniversary each year, when she'd insist on cooking even though neither of us was particularly good at it, and we'd eat something slightly overdone and laugh about it. The morning, 6 days before I filed for divorce, when I'd sat at that same counter running the math on the Hargrove steak sale for the first time, watching Natalie move around the kitchen getting ready for work, wondering if she had any idea what I already knew. I didn't feel sentimental standing there, exactly. I felt something closer to respect for the version of the marriage that had been real, for the years that had genuinely mattered before whatever had gone wrong started going wrong, and for my own decision, finally, to stop pretending the house could still mean what it used to mean once the two people who'd built that meaning had stopped being able to trust each other inside it. I locked the door, dropped the keys in the lockbox for the closing agent, and drove to Queen and without looking back at the house in my rearview mirror, which I mention only because I genuinely expected to look back, and the fact that I didn't need to told me something true about where I actually was, emotionally, by that point in the process. Part 11, The Fallout. The Hargrove hospitality sale closed 6 weeks later. The regional fund that Priya had identified took the 15% stake at a valuation that reflected the business's real, if modest, growth over the 9 years I'd been involved. Just under $2 million for a position I'd originally taken as collateral on a $410,000 loan. Gerald called me once, during that process, not to yell, which I'd braced for, but to ask, in a voice that sounded older than I remembered it being, whether there was anything he could have done differently. "You could have told me what you saw happening under your own roof 5 months before I had to find out on my own," I said. It wasn't cruel. It was just the plain truth of it, and I think he knew that, because he didn't argue with me. "I didn't want to be the one to tell you," he admitted. "I told myself it wasn't my business." "It became your business the moment it started costing you a business partner," I said, and we left it there, because there wasn't really anywhere else productive for that conversation to go. The house sale took longer. Neither of us wanted to be the one who moved out permanently while the other stayed, so we agreed to sell it outright and split the proceeds according to what Priya and Natalie's attorney worked out. A fair split, weighted slightly in my favor given the down payment I'd made from money earned before the marriage, but nothing punitive. I didn't want to win the divorce. I wanted to close it, cleanly, the way you close any deal that stopped making sense to keep open. I moved into a 2-bedroom condo in Queen and with a view of the Sound, a place I'd actually looked at almost a year earlier, back before any of this started, back when I'd been half joking with myself about whether I even needed that much space. I hadn't bought it then. I bought it 3 weeks after the house on Everett Street went on the market, because it turned out I did need that much space after all, just not for the reasons I'd originally imagined. Trent Ashford's contracting business, as far as I've heard through mutual acquaintances in the Seattle design-build world, took a real hit once word got around about how the affair had ended his relationship with Natalie and because these things travel. Cost her father a controlling stake in family business he'd spent 30 years building. I didn't do anything to make that happen. I didn't need to. Small industries talk, and people generally don't want to hire the contractor everyone knows blew up someone's marriage for a fling that didn't even last past the divorce filing. Natalie and Trent, as it turns out, didn't make it either. I heard from Caleb, who heard from a mutual friend, that it ended within about 4 months of the divorce being finalized. Apparently the version of Trent who'd been exciting as a secret stopped being quite as exciting once he was just a boyfriend with an unstable business and no more forbidden thrill attached to the arrangement. Part 12, Interlude, Thanksgiving. There's one more moment from that period I want to include, because I think it says more about how the family absorbed all of this than almost anything else I've described. Thanksgiving came about 5 months after the divorce was finalized, and it was the first major holiday I'd spent without Natalie in 11 years. Caleb hosted, at his place in Tacoma, and our father drove down from Everett where he still lives in the same house he and my mother bought in 1987. It was a smaller table than usual. Just the 3 of us, plus Caleb's wife Renee and their 2 kids. But it was the first holiday in longer than I could remember where I didn't feel like I was performing contentment for an audience that had quietly stopped believing in it. Renee, who'd never been anything but kind to Natalie over the years, brought it up gently over pie. "Do you ever think about calling her?" she asked. "Just to see how she's doing, not to get back together, just to check in." "Sometimes," I admitted. "Mostly around the holidays, honestly. There's a version of muscle memory that doesn't care that the marriage is over. It just remembers that this is the time of year we'd call her parents and coordinate whose family we were seeing when." "Do you regret any of it?" she asked. "The way you handled it, I mean. The timing of the filing, the equity sale, all of it." I thought about that question longer than the others, because it was the one I hadn't fully answered even for myself yet. "No," I said finally. "I regret that it happened at all. I don't regret how I responded to it. Those are 2 different things, and I think it took me most of this year to actually separate them in my own head." My father, who'd been quiet through most of this exchange, set down his fork. "You know what the difference is between a man who handles a crisis well and a man who just gets lucky?" he asked, to nobody in particular, in the way he does when he's about to make a point he's clearly been sitting on. "The lucky one only looks calm because nothing actually went wrong. The one who handles it well stays calm precisely because something did go wrong, and he already knew, deep down, exactly what he'd do the day it happened." Ethan didn't figure out how to respond to Natalie in the moment. He'd been building the discipline to respond to something like that his whole life, he just didn't know yet what it would be for. Caleb raised his glass at that, half joking, half not. "To knowing what you do before you need to do it." We all drank to that, and it was, without exaggeration, one of the better Thanksgivings I can remember, precisely because it was smaller and quieter and built entirely around people who'd shown up for the actual worst week of my life rather than just the good years that came before it. Part 13, 6 months later. I want to tell you about a phone call I got about 6 months after the divorce was finalized, because it's the part of this story that actually changed the direction of my life rather than just closing out the old one. A man named Preston Okafor called my office on a Wednesday morning. He ran a regional real estate development fund out of Portland, and he'd apparently been following the Hargrove Hospitality situation from a distance. The sale of my equity stake, the fund that had picked it up, the operational changes since. He wasn't interested in the hospitality business specifically. He was interested in me. "I've been watching how you structure things," he told me. "The way you held that Hargrove position for almost a decade without ever needing control, and then unwound it cleanly the moment it stopped making sense. That's not common. Most people either hang on too long out of sentiment or they panic and torch things unnecessarily. You did neither." We had lunch 2 weeks later, at a place near Pioneer Square that Preston picked because, he told me later, he liked to watch how people treated the staff when they thought a deal wasn't yet on the table. I apparently passed that particular test without knowing I was taking it, which he found funnier than I did once he admitted it. Over the next 2 months, we went back and forth on structure. Preston wanted a fund of one arrangement initially, dedicated purely to his capital, while I pushed for something closer to a proper limited partnership that would let me bring on additional investors down the line without renegotiating everything from scratch. Priya handled the legal architecture, the same way she'd handled the divorce filing and the Hargrove sale, and I remember sitting in her office reviewing the term sheet for the new fund and thinking about how strange it was that the same lawyer who'd helped me end a marriage was now helping me build the next real chapter of the business, using almost identical instincts. Protect the downside first. Define the exit before you define the entry, never take on a partner you haven't fully vetted. For how they behave when things go wrong rather than how they behave when things go right. 3 months after that lunch, Cole Bridge Capital took on its first outside limited partner commitment, an $8 million allocation from Preston's fund, specifically earmarked for the kind of small business bridge lending I'd been doing on my own capital for over a decade. It was the first time in my career I'd taken on outside money, and it happened not despite the divorce, but in a strange, indirect way, because of it. Because the way I'd handled the end of my marriage had become, without my ever intending it to, a kind of credential. I called my father the night the commitment closed, mostly out of habit, because he's the person I've called after every major milestone in my career since I was 26 years old and closed my first small deal out of a rented office above a dry cleaner in Ballard. $8 million, he repeated, when I told him. From a man who never would have called you if you hadn't gone through the worst year of your adult life first. Funny how that works, I said. It's not funny, it's just true, he said. People trust the guy who kept his composure when his own house was on fire. That's not luck, Ethan. That's just what happens when you finally get to show people who you actually are under pressure, instead of just telling them about it at dinner parties. He paused. Your mother would have liked watching this part. The part where it actually pays off. My mother passed away when I was 19, a detail I haven't mentioned yet because it hasn't been directly relevant to this story until now, but I think about her more than I let on, especially in moments like that one, moments where something hard finally resolves into something good, because she was the one who taught me, long before Natalie or Cole Bridge or any of it, that the measure of a person isn't how they behave when everything's easy. It's what they do the week everything falls apart. There's something clarifying about surviving the thing you were most afraid of. I'd spent years quietly worried, somewhere underneath all the confidence, that if Natalie ever left, I wouldn't know how to be a person on my own, that the version of myself I'd built the business and the house and the whole structure of my adult life around required her presence to keep functioning. I found out, in the 6 months after those suitcases sat by the front door, that the opposite was true. I didn't fall apart. I built something new, on better terms, with clearer eyes about who deserved a seat at my table and who didn't. Part 14, Running into Her. I ran into Natalie once, about a year after the divorce was finalized, at a farmer's market in Fremont on a Saturday morning I almost didn't go to. She looked well. Not performed well, the way she used to look at Patterson-style family dinners. Actually well, in the specific way people look when they've stopped carrying something heavy for long enough that their shoulders finally remember how to sit differently. She was alone, holding a bag of produce, and she saw me at almost the same moment I saw her. Ethan, she said. Natalie. There was a pause, not an uncomfortable one, just a pause, the kind two people share when they're deciding how much history to let into a conversation that's supposed to be brief. "How are you?" she asked. "Good," I said, and meant it. "Really good, actually. The firm took on its first outside investor a few months back." "That's wonderful," she said, and there was something genuine in it, something that told me whatever else had gone wrong between us, she'd never actually stopped wanting good things for me, even in the middle of everything. "I heard about that, actually. Through my dad. He mentioned it like he was still proud of you, which I know probably sounds strange." "It doesn't," I said. "I'm not angry at your father. I was never really angry at him. I was angry at the situation he let happen under his roof without saying anything." She nodded slowly. "He knows that. I think that's part of why he still talks about you the way he does." "How's the business doing? Under the new ownership?" "Different," she said. "Harder, honestly. The fund wants growth targets Dad never had to think about before. But it's still standing. He's still standing." She adjusted the bag of produce in her hands. "I'm sorry, Ethan. For all of it. Not just Trent. For not sitting with you longer when you were sick. For not asking how you were doing instead of just handling logistics. I think about that more than almost anything else from that whole period." "I believe you," I said, and I did. "Do you think we could have made it, if I hadn't Tyro?" She stopped herself before finishing the sentence, like she wasn't sure she actually wanted the answer. I thought about it honestly before I answered, because she deserved an honest answer rather than a comfortable one. "I don't know," I said. "I think we'd stopped really seeing each other a while before Trent ever showed up. I think he was a symptom of something that had already gone quiet between us, not the actual cause of it. But I don't know that for certain." "Neither do you." She smiled, small and a little sad. "That's a very calm answer." "I've had a year to get calm about it," I said. "It wasn't calm in the beginning. You know that better than almost anyone." "I do," she said. She shifted the bag of produce to her other hand. "For what it's worth, I don't think I ever stopped respecting you, even in the middle of everything. I think that's part of why it took me as long as it did to actually leave. It's easier to walk away from someone you've talked yourself into resenting than someone you still genuinely admire." "I believe that," I said. "I think I felt something similar, honestly. It would have been easier, in a strange way, if I'd hated you by the end of it. I never quite got there." "Maybe that's a good thing," she said. "Maybe it means neither of us has to carry around a version of this where the other person was simply a villain the whole time." "Maybe," I agreed. "Take care of yourself, Ethan," she said. "You too, Natalie." We went our separate ways after that, and I didn't feel the ache I expected to feel watching her walk off into the crowd at that market. I felt something closer to completion, the specific, quiet satisfaction of watching a chapter end exactly where it was supposed to end, without any loose thread still pulling at either one of us. Part 15, What I Actually Learned. I've had a lot of time to think about that morning in the kitchen, the suitcases, the coffee, the flat instruction to go stay somewhere else while I was still recovering from the sickest I'd been in a decade. There's a version of this story where I'm the villain, and I want to acknowledge that version exists, the same way I'd acknowledge it in any deal I've ever closed that left someone worse off than they started. A man quietly dismantles his father-in-law's business, sells a stake worth $2 million, times a divorce filing so precisely that his wife doesn't even know she's already been served with papers before she finishes kicking him out of his own house. I understand how that reads from the outside. But here's what actually happened, as plainly as I can say it. I didn't file those papers to punish Natalie. I filed them because I'd found clear, repeated evidence that the marriage I thought I was in had stopped existing months earlier, and I've spent my entire career believing that the moment you know something is over, the responsible move is to close it cleanly rather than let it decay in public, one slow humiliation at a time. I didn't sell the Hargrove stake out of spite toward Gerald. I sold it because the only reason that position had ever made sense was a trust that no longer existed, and holding on to capital in a relationship built on trust that's already broken isn't loyalty. It's just delay. People have told me since then that I handled it too coldly, that I should have screamed at her in that kitchen, that I should have thrown something, said something cruel, made her feel even a fraction of what I felt standing there with a fever finally breaking and 2 suitcases packed with my own clothes waiting by the door. I understand why people think that's what strength looks like. But I've spent 20 years in rooms where the person who reacts loudest is almost always the person who ends up with the least control over what happens next, and I wasn't willing to hand her that kind of control over the worst week of my adult life. I felt everything. I want to be completely clear about that, because I think the calm version of this story can make it sound like none of it actually hurt. It hurt in the specific, physical way that only real loss hurts. Lying in my brother's guest room at 2 a.m., still weak from being sick, running through 9 years of a marriage and trying to find the exact moment it had quietly ended before either of us said the words out loud. I felt it in the empty side of the bed at Caleb's place, in the specific brand of coffee Natalie liked that I kept buying out of habit for 2 months after she was gone, in the silence of a condo that didn't yet have enough furniture to make noise when I walked through it. I felt every bit of it. I just didn't let the feeling drive the decisions, because I've learned, the hard way, that the two things feeling something completely and reacting to it immediately were never actually the same skill, and confusing them is how people end up losing twice, once to the betrayal, and once to their own worst response to it. My father asked me, a few months after everything settled, whether I was happy. I told him I wasn't sure happy was the right word yet, but that I was solid, in a way I hadn't been in the last couple years of the marriage without realizing it. He nodded like that answer satisfied him more than happy would have. Solid's the foundation, he said. Happy's just what you build on top of it, once you trust the ground again. He's not wrong about much, my father. 20 years in a fire company teaches you the difference between something that looks stable and something that actually is, and it turns out that's a skill that transfers a lot further than either of us ever expected. I think, too, about what this whole experience taught me about the particular cruelty of timing the way Natalie chose to end things, not when I was strong, not when I could stand at full height and meet her eyes without my legs shaking, but during the 1 week in years when I had the least capacity to defend myself. I don't think she did that consciously, and I've made peace with that. I think it's simpler and sadder than that. I think she'd been carrying the decision for weeks, maybe months, and it finally broke loose the moment she saw me at my most diminished, because some part of her understood, even if she never said it out loud, that a weakened man is easier to walk away from than a strong one. There's no accusation I can make about that changes anything now. I only mention it because I think a lot of people listening to this have lived some version of it themselves, being left, or betrayed, or diminished, at the exact moment they had the least energy left to respond to it. If that's you, I want you to hear this clearly: the timing of someone's cruelty is not a measure of your weakness. It's a measure of theirs. Strong people don't wait for you to be sick to tell you the truth. They tell you when you're standing tall enough to hear it and still keep walking afterward. I also think about Gerald sometimes, more than I expected to. I ran into him once, about 8 months after the divorce, at a hospitality industry conference in Portland that neither of us knew the other would be attending. We ended up standing near the same coffee station, and there was an awkward beat where neither of us was sure whether to acknowledge each other at all. "Ethan," he said finally. "Gerald. How's the business?" "Standing," he said, echoing almost exactly what Natalie had told me at the farmer's market. "The fund's been harder to work with than you ever were, if I'm being honest. They want quarterly reporting I never had to think about before. But we're still open. Still 3 properties." He hesitated. "I should have said something to you, back when it started. About Trent. I saw more than I let on, and I told myself it wasn't my place." "I know," I said. "I've made my peace with that part of it." "Have you?" he asked, and there was something searching in the question, like he genuinely wanted to know whether that was true or whether I was just being polite. "Mostly," I said, because that was the honest answer. I think you loved your daughter more than you trusted your own judgment about what she was doing, and I understand that impulse even if it cost me something real. I don't think you're a bad man, Gerald. I think you're a father who didn't want to be the one to tell his son-in-law something that would break his family apart. I just wish you trusted me enough to let me decide what to do with that information myself, instead of deciding for me by staying quiet. He nodded slowly, and we didn't say much else after that, but I remember feeling, walking away from that conversation, that it had closed something in me I hadn't realized was still slightly open. If you've made it all the way to the end of this story, I want to ask you something directly. Do you think staying composed in a moment like that sick, betrayed, quietly kicked out of your own home is the right way to handle it, or do you think there's something lost in never letting the anger out where the person who caused it can actually see it? I genuinely go back and forth on this myself, even now, so I want to hear what you think. Drop a comment below and let me know. Before I go, I want to tell you one last thing, because I think it's the piece of this whole story that actually matters most, more than the equity sale or the mediation or even the suitcases by the front door. About 2 months ago, I started seeing someone. Her name is Alicia, she's a structural engineer, and we met, of all places, at a building inspection for a property Cole Bridge was underwriting a loan against. She noticed a load-bearing issue in the original blueprints that 3 other inspectors had missed, and I remember standing in that half-finished building thinking that I recognized the specific kind of competence she had, the same way I'd recognized it in Natalie 9 years earlier at that hospital gala, except this time I found myself watching for something different too, not just whether she was good at what she did, but whether she was the kind of person who'd sit with you for longer than 4 minutes when you were sick. We haven't been together long enough for me to know how the story ends, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise for the sake of a tidy narrative. But 2 weeks ago I came down with a bad cold, nothing like the pneumonia, nothing close to as serious, and Alicia showed up at my condo unannounced with soup and a stack of paperback novels and stayed on my couch reading for 4 hours just so I wouldn't be alone while I felt lousy. I didn't ask her to. She just came. And I remember lying there, still congested, half asleep, thinking that it had taken me 42 years and one badly ended marriage to finally understand the difference between a partner who manages your life well and a partner who actually shows up for you when managing isn't enough anymore. That's the real ending of this story, as much as any story like this ever really ends. Not the equity sale. Not the suitcases. Not even the quiet satisfaction of watching a plan I built alone finally close exactly the way I intended it to. It's the 4 hours on a couch with someone who didn't have to be there and came anyway. If this story resonated with you at all, hit subscribe, because there are more stories like this one coming, real accounts of the moments that quietly end one version of a life and start another, and I'd love to have you here for the next one. Take care of yourselves out there, and remember the calmest person in the room isn't always the coldest one. Sometimes they're just the one who already knows exactly how the story ends, and is patient enough to let it end that way on its own.